Film begins in Spiderhead, a state-of-the-art penitentiary, where some prisoners volunteered themselves for a series of experiments researching human emotions. A researcher named Steve Abnesti and his assistant Mark giving a dose of G46 to the prisoner. The G46 causes the man to burst out laughing, even when Mark is reading depressing historical facts. Steve believes the test is successful. The following day, prisoner Jeff is blinded for a special N40 dose test. Jeff sees things in a beautiful way as a result of the effect. They add a dose B15. Jeff now sees a gorgeous view of paradise on Earth. However, it was discovered that Jeff had been looking at a contaminated area. For the next experiment, Jeff is partnered with prisoner Heather. They had never interacted before and are just mildly interested in each other. However, after Mark gives N40 to them, Jeff and Heather begin to see each other as extraordinarily gorgeous. The two remove their clothes and begin to make out. Steve and Mark are overjoyed with the success of N40 love dose. Steve would like to learn more about if the love lasts. Jeff and Heather felt quite weird being naked next to someone they didn't know when the dose had worn off. Later, as Jeff is serving food with his friend, Lizzie, he brings it to Heather, and things between them are awkward. They don't even speak to each other. The love doesn't last as long as Steve hoped. However, this does not stop Steve from repeating the experiment. This time, Jeff gets partnered with an older prisoner woman named Sarah who he isn't interested at all. But when Jeff gets a double dose of N40, he can't stop himself from making love with her. One day, Jeff joins Steve and Mark at the testing room for the next experiment, which involves Heather and Sarah. Steve wants Jeff to pick between Heather and Sarah to receive a dose of I-16, which is classified as an agitator with no long-term effects. Jeff is uncomfortable with this option and refuses to make one, although he emphasizes that if he had to, he would make a random choice because he has no feelings for any of them. He also claims that he is just rejecting because he has already been given that chemical and recalls how much he despises it. For the next experiment, Jeff is partnered with a huge prisoner with an aggressive attitude named Rogan. Jeff has no interest in man and is concerned that he would make love with Rogan by giving him N40. He refuses to accept it. Finally, nothing happens, and they are free to leave. Jeff runs to the testing room and discovers Heather, who was asked to give I-16 to either Jeff or Rogan and chose neither. This also implies that Heather made love with Rogan during one of the experiments. Jeff is enraged and wants to know whether everyone is making love with everyone. Steve gives him a chart that shows the data among the prisoners and says that it is an experimental design mandated by the protocol committee. Steve also reminds him that it was he who volunteered. Jeff apologizes and returns for another experiment with Rogan. Sarah is asked to give I-16 to either Jeff or Rogan this time, and she chooses neither. After the experiment is done, Steve believes the dose is ready. However, Mark is becoming uneasy with it, and Steve reminds him that this is a vital job in order to make the world a better place. Steve decides to take a risk and ask Mark to give him a triple dose of the chemicals. Suddenly, Jeff appears and catches them in the act. They quickly hide it, and Jeff pretends he didn't see it. For the next experiment, Steve informs Jeff that the committee has instructed them to proceed with the I-16 testing. So, Jeff has no choice except to give I-16 to Heather. Jeff still refuses to do it and asks Steve to persuade the committee to reconsider. Steve walks out of the room, claiming to call the committee, but instead he goes to the kitchen to get some coffee and talk with Lizzie for a while. When Steve returns, he tells Jeff that the committee has refused to change their decision and that Jeff must ahead with the experiment. Otherwise, Jeff will be sent back to the prison state. Since he has no other option, Jeff agrees to give Heather I-16, and she immediately feels agonizing. Heather bumps her back to the wall and breaks the Moby Pock, forcing the I-16 to flutter. Heather becomes extremely aggressive, to the point where she breaks a vase and becomes an incident. Steve runs out of the room to check on her, dropping his keys. Jeff seizes the opportunity to obtain access to Steve's notebook. He discovers a chemical formula called OBDX on a piece of paper with the Abnesti Pharmaceuticals logo. This implies that Steve is the owner and there are no committee. Jeff then discovers a bingo board covered in gold stars, with the exception of two numbers, 6 and 40. Jeff sees Steve returning before he can look any more into it. He puts everything away and throws the keys on the floor. Mark requests that Steve report the incident, but Steve refuses, fearing that doing it will result to shut the Spiderhead down. Steve discovers Jeff and Lizzie eating a snack in the kitchen. A plan begins to form in his mind. Later, when he examines the security camera, he notices that Jeff has been drawing Lizzie. Steve believes that he is on the correct path. The next day, Jeff has one more test to give I-16 to Lizzie. Jeff is enraged and refuses immediately. Steve dismisses him and tells him to think about it until the next morning. As soon as Jeff leaves the room, Steve instructs Mark to double Jeff's B6 dose. When Mark enters the room, Jeff confronts him with the truth. There is no committee and Steve is only care about B6. Mark explains that he wanted to work with a true genius and that Jeff had promised to change the world, but now he regrets it. Jeff persuades Mark to work together. Because Mark is unwell, Steve and Jeff are the only ones in the testing room. Jeff is given the authority to inject I-16 into Lizzie, but he continues to reject, which enrages Steve. Steve tries to persuade Jeff by telling him about Lizzie's crime of killing her baby. Lizzie breaks in tears as she asks Jeff for the I-16, forcing Jeff to comply. However, Mark has changed the program such that the control is injected to Steve instead of Lizzie, causing him to screaming in pain. Jeff forces Steve to tell the truth about B6, also known as OBDX, a substance that induces perfect obedience with no exceptions in the person who is injected. Steve believes that OBDX will make the world a better place. Steve also reveals that Jeff was free to go 7 months ago. When he hears this, he pushes Steve and forces him to open the front door. However, Steve attacks Jeff and grabs the control to give 4 doses of I-16 to Lizzie, causing her to go insane. Jeff strikes Steve, causing him to break the control. He also pushed him up against the wall, causing Jeff's Moby Pock break. Jeff rushes into the experiment room, removing all of the chemical bottles from Lizzie's Moby Pock. Steve makes an announcement that if the other prisoners don't want to go back to the prison state, they must stop Jeff and Lizzie. Steve notices on the security cameras that the police are approaching the building. So, he grabs as many chemical vials as he can and flees. Jeff and Lizzie make it to the end of the corridor and locking the door. However, Steve had already left on his private plane by the time they arrive outside. Since N40 has taken over Steve's mind, he can only see a beautiful sky ahead of him instead of a mountain that will cause him to crash the plane into it. Meanwhile, Jeff and Lizzie drive a motorboat and get their freedom. That's all for today, kids. Help Daddy by like and subscribe. See you on the next videos.